Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. Whose land, son? 3 words. That's all it took to turn a $40 million groundbreaking into a funeral nobody had buried yet. 40 investors stood frozen on that stretch of marsh grass, champagne glasses catching the morning light, waiting to see if Brayden Stein's hand would shake before his voice did. I was 70 years old, holding a folder that weighed nothing and everything at once. But to understand how a dead man ended up standing in that crowd, you have to go back 3 days, to a text message that arrived while I was still very much alive, drinking Josue Fry's burnt coffee in his kitchen on St. Helena Island. The morning of Leilani's text, I woke before the sun did. 38 years of walking property lines does that to a man. You stop trusting the day until you've paced its edges yourself. Josue's kitchen smelled like chicory and old paper. 4 decades of land law files stacked along the counter like a second set of walls holding the room up. Somewhere out past the screen door, the tide was already pulling back from the pluff mud, leaving that low salt smell that never quite washes out of a low country morning. I was pouring my second cup when my phone buzzed against the table, the screen lighting up before I'd even picked it up. Leilani, Grandpa's gone. The land is finally ours. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it. I understood it clear as a benchmark stake driven 6 inches into dry ground. I read it twice because for 1 full second, I let myself feel it as if it were true. 6 years since I'd buried my wife Emmeline in the churchyard off Land's End Road. It would have been a mercy almost to lie down next to her instead of doing what I was about to do to the people I had left. Josue set his cup down without a sound. He'd been watching my face, not the phone. She sent it? 15 minutes ago. I turned the screen toward him. The land is finally ours. He read it, and something moved behind his eyes, not surprise. Josue had spent 40 years reading land records for a living. He knew the difference between a fact and a claim dressed up to look like one, and he could smell the difference from across a kitchen table. Finally, he repeated, letting the word sit there like it had weight. That's an interesting word to put in a text about your own grandfather dying. I set the phone face down on the table. Outside the window, gulls were working the tide line same as they did every morning, whether a man was alive or dead. The world doesn't stop to notice which one you are. She didn't write that sentence for me, Josue. She wrote it for herself. Something she's been waiting a long time to believe. You don't sound angry. I'm not angry yet. I wasn't lying. Anger takes time to travel up from wherever a man keeps it buried, same as water finding its way through clay before it ever reaches the surface. What I felt instead was colder and more useful, the particular stillness that comes right before you drive the first stake of a survey, when you already know where every boundary is going to fall. You just haven't told anyone yet. 2 weeks earlier, Crystal Reed had signed the paperwork moving me out of Marshview's private wing and into the general ward, citing a plumbing repair that would take, in her words, a few days, tops. I'd spent 70 years learning to read the fine print other people hoped you'd skip past without asking questions. I read Crystal Reed's face instead of her paperwork that day, and her face told me everything the paperwork left out. Josue refilled my cup without asking. You want to tell me the rest of it, or you want me to guess? Later, I said. Right now, I want to know one thing. Where's Brayden? Halfway to your kitchen table, I'd imagine. Man like that doesn't wait for a body to go cold before he starts measuring the furniture for a new sofa. Josue turned his own cup in slow circles on the table the way he did when he was working up to something he didn't want to say outright. You know, the county's had a habit lately. Records going missing, deeds, old suits nobody's looked at in 60 years gone quiet from the shelf like they walked off on their own. I wouldn't go poking through that archive without watching your back, Corbin. I didn't answer that yet. I filed it away the way I'd filed every stray fact in 38 years of surveying. Not forgotten, just waiting for the rest of the picture to catch up to it. I picked the phone back up and read the text one more time. The land is finally ours. Leilani had no idea how wrong those 5 words were or how long it would take her to find out. I walked to the window and looked out past the marsh toward the road that led home, toward a house full of people right now popping champagne over a coffin, with nobody in it mourning a death that hadn't happened for a piece of land that had never belonged to them in the first place. Let them celebrate, I thought. A man only gets to watch his own funeral once. I intended to enjoy every last minute of mine. 2 weeks before that text message, I was still living where I'd lived for 4 years, the private wing at Marshview, a room with my own window and a nurse who knew I took my grits without sugar. Then Crystal Reed came in on a Tuesday with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach past her teeth. A pipe had burst in the private wing, she said. A few days, tops. She'd move me to the general ward while they made repairs. I'd spent 38 years reading surveys where somebody had shaved a foot off a property line and hoped nobody would walk it with a chain. I know what a lie looks like when it's wearing a work order for a costume. But I let her move me anyway, because a man learns more sitting still and watching than he ever learns fighting from the start. The general ward smelled like bleach fighting a losing battle. Thin mattress, no window worth the name, a call button that nobody answered past 9 at night. 2 days in, I watched an aide chart my blood pressure without ever touching my arm. 3 days in, I heard her on the phone in the hallway telling somebody the private wing's repair didn't have a completion date because there was no repair, just an empty room somebody was fixing to red out twice. That's when I stopped waiting to see how bad it would get and started planning how I'd leave. On the 6th night, the front desk went quiet at 11 and stayed quiet. I've spent a career walking property lines through briar and marsh mud in July. Getting past one sleeping security guard and a door that didn't latch right wasn't a survey, it was a stroll. I walked 2 miles down Sea Island Parkway in my own clothes, which I'd kept folded at the bottom of my bag the whole time because I never once believed that pipe story. A night clerk at the Circle K let me use the phone behind the counter without asking why a 70-year-old man in a windbreaker needed to call somebody at midnight. Josue picked up on the second ring. He didn't ask questions either. He just told me to stand under the light by the ice machine and wait. I've known Josue Fry since we were boys, catching whiting off the dock at Land's End, back before either of us had gray in our hair or a law degree or a survey license between us. He drove up 20 minutes later without another word, and by the time we pulled into his driveway, I'd already decided something I hadn't said out loud yet, not even to myself. Sitting in his kitchen that first night, I took the compass out of my jacket pocket, my father's compass brass gone dull with age, the kind surveyors carried before anybody trusted the ones that ran on batteries. There's a line engraved along the inside of the case, worn thin enough now that you have to already know the words to read them. Boundaries protect, they don't divide. My father had it made the year he won a piece of paper he never once mentioned at a single Sunday dinner for the rest of his life. I used to think that was strange, a man carrying a victory in his coat pocket and never showing it to the people who'd have wanted to celebrate it with him. I didn't think it was strange anymore. Sitting in Josue's kitchen with a family 2 miles away, already dividing up my house, I understood exactly why my father had done it. Some truths, once you say them, you can't control what people do with them. You can only control whether you hand them over. Leilani still had a shoebox in her closet. I knew because I'd seen it once years back helping her move, full of photographs from before her grandmother died, and she hadn't opened it since. Some people keep grief in a box because looking at it costs more than they can spend. I understood that too. Maybe better than I wanted to admit. "You've been quiet a long time, Corbin," Josue said, setting a second cup of coffee in front of me, though the first one had gone cold, untouched. "I've watched you go quiet before. It usually costs somebody something before it's over." "Cost's already been spent," I said. "Question is, who collects?" He studied me the way he used to study a survey he didn't trust, looking for where the numbers had been nudged. "You planning on staying dead a while?" It wasn't a question, not really. I looked at the compass in my hand, turned it once, the needle finding true north the same way it had for 60 years, no matter which way the case was pointed. Whatever else changed, that needle never lied about where it stood. "Let them bury me," I said. "Let them dig the whole grave before I tell them it's empty. That's the only way I'll ever find out who's really standing at the edge of it grieving and who's already measuring the plot for something else." Josue didn't argue. He just nodded once, the way a man nods when he's already decided to walk into something with you, consequences and all, and reached for the phone to call the rest of the people who were about to find out that Corbin Bradford wasn't nearly as gone as his granddaughter believed. Carter Romero showed up at Josue's back door before noon, out of breath, holding a manila folder against his chest like it might blow away if he loosened his grip. He was 28, built like the shrimp boats he crewed on before the season turned slow, and he'd been dropping off fish at my dock every Friday since I helped his grandmother keep her half-acre out of a tax sale 11 years back. He didn't knock so much as announce himself. "Mr. Bradford, you're supposed to be dead." He said it flat, like a man confirming an address. "Good. That makes this easier to explain because I don't think I could have said any of it to your face at a funeral." I let him in. Josue poured him coffee he didn't touch. Carter spread the folder open on the kitchen table like a man laying out a hand of cards he already knew was bad. "I work weekends helping old man Pinckney file paperwork down at the title company," he said. "Boring work. Until 3 weeks ago when I started noticing the same buyer's name showing up on deed transfers all across the county. Little bitty shares, 1/4 of an acre here, an 1/8 there, heirs shares, people selling off pieces of land they only half own to begin with." "That's not unusual on its own," Josue said. "Heirs property gets chipped away at every year. It's how half this county changed hands the wrong direction over the last 100 years. "I know that," Carter said. "What's unusual is the buyer." He turned the folder toward me. "Coastal Renewal Holdings, LLC? Been buying up fractional shares in the Bradford tract for going on 2 years now. Your cousin Vermel sold her 1/12 share for $800 14 months ago. Your late uncle's grandson in Buford sold his 1/16 for $600. There's 9 different transactions here, all small, all quiet, all the same buyer." I looked at the names. I knew half of them third cousins a great-nephew I'd sent a Christmas card to every year since he was born, people who'd never once set foot on the 40 acres they technically owned a sliver of, who had no idea what that sliver was worth or what it meant to sell it. $800 for a share of land worth by any honest appraisal closer to $60,000. "Coastal Renewal Holdings," I said. "I don't know that name." "Nobody does," Carter said. "That's the point of an LLC, isn't it? But I pulled the filing with the Secretary of State this morning before I came over here." He slid a second paper across the table, a single registered agent line highlighted in yellow marker. Registered agent's a law office in Buford, same office that filed the incorporation papers for Palmetto Coastal Development 3 years back. Josue went still in the way he did when a fact landed somewhere important. "Palmetto Coastal Development is Brayden Stein's company." "Yes, sir, it is." Nobody said anything for a moment. Outside, a boat engine turned over somewhere down the creek, ordinary as breakfast, while the 3 of us sat with a folder that said a man had spent 2 years quietly buying his way into owning a piece of land he'd been telling everyone as of 3 days ago he'd just inherited whole and clean. "He wasn't waiting on me to die," I said slowly, working it through the way I'd work through a survey with a boundary that didn't sit right. "He was building toward it. If enough of the family shares belonged to him outright and I passed, he wouldn't need to fight anybody for the rest. He'd already owned the majority interest walking in the door." "There's one more thing," Carter said, and for the first time since he'd sat down, he looked uncomfortable, like the next sentence cost him something to say out loud. "Vermel's share. The $800. I asked around. She didn't go looking to sell it. Somebody came to her, told her the land was tied up bad in some old lawsuit that her share might end up worth nothing at all if it wasn't settled soon." Told her she was lucky anybody wanted to buy it. I sat back. Some old lawsuit. 2 words that hadn't meant anything to me an hour ago, and now sat in the room like a third guest nobody had invited. Whoever told her that, Josue said quietly, knew about a lawsuit involving this land before you did, Corbin. Before I did, and I've handled half this family's paperwork for 40 years. I thought about my father, about a compass, with words worn thin from being touched too many times by a man who never explained why. Boundaries protect, they don't divide. He'd fought for something once and never told a soul what it was. If there was a case sitting in some courthouse basement with the Bradford name on it, I intended to be the one who read it first, not the last one to find out what it said. There's a county archive at the courthouse in Bradford, I said. Records going back 100 years, most of it never digitized. If there's a lawsuit with our name attached, it'll be there, and I know exactly who to ask. Adonis, Josue said. Adonis, I agreed, already reaching for my coat. A dead man walking into a records room in broad daylight wasn't the safest plan I'd ever made. It also wasn't the worst one. Adonis Castillo had run the archive room at the Bradford County Courthouse for 22 years, long enough to know every warped floorboard and every box that had been misfiled since the Nixon administration. He also knew me well enough that when I walked in wearing my late father-in-law's old fishing cap, pulled low, and a windbreaker that wasn't mine, he didn't say my name out loud. He just went pale, glanced twice at the security camera bolted above the reference desk, and said, "Back office." Now, in a voice pitched for nobody but me to hear. He locked the door behind us. The back office smelled like dust and toner boxes stacked to the ceiling, a single window painted shut sometime before either of us was born. Adonis dropped into his chair like his knees had finally decided to collect on 40 years of standing. "You're supposed to be at Duffy's funeral home right about now," he said. "I heard they've got you scheduled for Thursday." "Change of plans," I said. "I need everything the county's got on a case called Bradford versus the County of Bradford, 1961. Something crossed his face, not surprise exactly, more like recognition arriving late to a party it should have come to hours ago. He turned to his computer, typed for a while, frowned at the screen, typed again. "That's strange," he said. "System shows the physical file exists, box 14, row C downstairs, but it's got a partial seal on it. Court Order 1962, restricting public access to a portion of the record. I've worked here 2 decades, and I've maybe seen 5 files with a seal like that. Can you open it?" "For you, and only because you're supposedly dead, and this whole thing is already sideways, yes. But Corbin..." He stopped typing and looked at me straight on for the first time since I'd walked in. "I need to tell you something first, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it's going to sound." I sat down across from him. Whatever was coming, I could feel the shape of it before he said the words, the way you can feel a change in weather in your knees before the sky ever clouds over. 3 weeks ago, Adonis said, a man came in here asking about the same box. Didn't give a name I could verify. Badge said he was a title researcher, but the company on it doesn't exist. I checked after he left. He asked me how much it would cost to have box 14 come up missing during a routine digitization sweep. Not destroyed, just gone. Filed somewhere it'd take a court order and a miracle to ever find again. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the wall clock ticking through the closed door, and somewhere further off a copier finishing a job nobody had picked up. "What did you tell him?" "I told him county records don't go missing on my watch," Adonis said. "Told him if he came back, I'd have him escorted out by the sheriff's department personally." He left. Didn't argue, didn't get ugly about it. Just left calm as you please, like he'd expected that answer and had a second plan waiting behind it. I sat with that. 3 weeks. Before Crystal Reed's phantom plumbing repair, before Leilani's text message, before I even knew there was a case with my family's name on it worth hiding. Somebody knew about this file before I did, I said mostly to myself. Somebody knew about this file before either of us did, Corbin. That's the part that's been sitting wrong with me since he walked out that door. Adonis stood moved to a filing cabinet, pulled a set of keys from a ring on his belt. I can't tell you it was Brayden Stein standing in front of me. I never got a real name, and the description could fit half the men who buy suits at the outlet mall in Bluffton. Tall 40s, good haircut, expensive watch he kept checking, like it mattered more than the conversation. That's not much to go on. No, he agreed. It's not. But whoever he was working for, they wanted this file gone before your family ever had a reason to go looking for it. That's not a man covering a lie he already told. That's a man burying a truth he already knew was going to hurt him. Adonis led me down a narrow staircase to the records basement, unlocked a wire cage, and pulled box 14 off a shelf that hadn't been dusted since the seal was applied. He set it on a metal table between us, cut the strapping tape with a box cutter, and lifted the lid. I stood there a moment without reaching for anything. The overhead fluorescent buzzed once and steadied. Somewhere above us, a door opened and closed, footsteps crossing the main floor, ordinary sounds from an ordinary Tuesday, while I looked down at a court seal stamped in fading purple ink across a folder with my father's name typed above mine, and said nothing at all. Because there wasn't a word yet that fit what I was feeling. Adonis waited. He'd learned that much about grief and shock both, working 2 decades in a room full of other people's family histories. Finally, he reached in and lifted the folder out, weighing it once in his hands like he already suspected it was heavier than paper had any right to be. "You ready to know what your father spent his whole life not telling you?" he asked. I wasn't. I reached for it anyway. Brayden's laugh carried clear across the marsh road, loud enough that I heard it before I ever saw the house, sitting low in the cab of Carter's truck, with a ball cap pulled down and my heart doing something I hadn't asked it to do in 70 years. Carter had parked us under the live oaks across from my own front porch, close enough to see far enough that nobody walking my yard would think to look twice at an old truck with a fishing rod rack on the bed. I'd told myself I only needed 10 minutes. I stayed for 40. Brayden Stein moved through my house like a man touring a property he'd already closed on, which I suppose in his mind he had. He wore a blazer that didn't belong anywhere near marsh mud and carried a tablet he kept lifting to frame shots. The porch, the water beyond the dock, the long view down the tidal creek that had been in my family since before South Carolina had paved roads out this far. "This is the money shot right here," he said to nobody in particular, loud enough to carry, tilting the tablet toward the creek. "Ocean view, private dock access, mature oak canopy. You can't manufacture this. This is the whole pitch to investors right here in one frame." He turned in a slow circle on my own front porch, nodding at something only he could see. "We tear out this railing, open the whole front elevation to glass, and this house sells the entire development before we've poured a single foundation somewhere else on the tract." A young man with a clipboard trailed behind him, photographing everything. Brayden pointed at the porch swing my father built the year I turned 12, the hand-carved door frame, the old cast-iron dinner bell that had called 4 generations of Bradfords in from the fields, and the water. Leilani walked a few steps behind both of them, and even from across the road, even through the gap in the oak branches, I could see she wasn't moving like a woman touring her own inheritance. She was moving like a woman walking through a house she already half suspected she shouldn't be in. Brayden stopped in the front room and ran his hand along the edge of my grandmother's sweetgrass basket collection. 6 baskets my great-grandmother had coiled herself, each one worth more in craft and history than in the shallow dollar figure any appraiser would ever put on it. "These'll have to go in storage or the trash," he said. "They read country. We're marketing coastal luxury, not country. Nobody's paying $800 a night to look at baskets." "Those were my great-great-grandmother's," Leilani said quietly. It was the first full sentence I'd heard her speak since I'd started watching. "Sure. And they'll photograph beautifully in a museum somewhere if you want to donate them." Brayden didn't even turn around when he said it. He'd already moved on to the bookshelf, running a finger along a row of spines like he was pricing them by the linear foot. "Point is, they don't belong in the listing photos. Buyers want to see potential lay, not a history lesson." She didn't argue. That was the part that sat wrong in my chest, watching from across the road. Not that Brayden said what he said, because a man like that was always going to say something like that, the way water always finds the low ground. What sat wrong was Leilani's silence. 30 years of family sitting right there in 6 woven baskets, and she let the sentence pass by like weather. I thought about the file sitting on the seat beside me. Still sealed in the folder, Adonis had handed over the truth about that land waiting inside it like a held breath. Leilani had no idea she was standing in a house that wasn't legally divided between anybody. No idea the ground under Brayden's expensive shoes belonged to one name only, and that name wasn't Stein. Near the back hallway, Leilani stopped walking. Brayden and the photographer had moved on toward the kitchen, their voices fading into the argument over whether the cabinets were original or just old, as if there were a difference worth having an opinion about. Leilani stood alone in front of a cedar chest at the end of the hall, and even at that distance, I knew exactly what was inside it because I'd helped Emmeline pack it herself the year Leilani turned 9 and came to live with us for good. Leilani crouched down. She rested her hand flat on the lid of the chest, not opening it, just resting there, the way you touch a headstone when you're not ready yet to read what's carved into it. Her shoulders dropped an inch. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, she looked less like a woman helping her husband strip a house for parts, and more like a girl who used to fall asleep on that hallway floor waiting for her grandmother to finish quilting. "Lay?" Brayden's voice cut down the hall from the kitchen, sharp and impatient. "Come look at this. I think this backsplash is actual tile, not laminate. Might be worth something." Leilani's hand lifted off the chest like she'd been caught at something. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked toward his voice without a single word, back toward the cedar chest, though I noticed, and I don't think Carter did, sitting beside me, that she looked back at it once over her shoulder before she turned the corner into the kitchen. I sat very still in that truck a long while after she'd gone. Some doors, once a person starts to open them, don't stay closed as easy as they used to. Josue came back to the house a little after 7 that evening, and I knew before he said a word that whatever he'd gone to do, it hadn't gone the way either of us expected. He set his keys on the counter harder than he needed to and didn't reach for the coffee pot, which, for Josue Fry, was the same as another man announcing bad news with a bell. He'd gone to see Leilani that afternoon under the oldest cover a low-country family lawyer has, showing up with a casserole dish and a story about needing her signature on some old paperwork of mine that had apparently gone unfiled. Half true. Enough true to get him through the front door. "I found her sitting alone on the back steps," Josue said finally, pouring 2 cups and setting one in front of me without asking if I wanted it. Brayden was gone somewhere, some meeting he didn't tell her about. She looked like she hadn't slept right in a week, Corbin. Not grief-tired, scared-tired. There's a difference. And I've seen enough of both sitting across a table from clients to know it when it's looking back at me. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to stop a man mid-story is to interrupt him with a question he was already circling toward answering. "I told her how sorry I was about you," he went on. "Wasn't hard to sound sincere, seeing as I meant every word of missing you, even if the reason for it was a lie." She started crying before I even finished the sentence. Not the kind of crying somebody does for show, either. The kind that comes out sideways, like it's been backed up behind a dam for longer than one bad week could account for. "What did she say?" Josue turned his cup a slow half-circle on the table, same as he always did when he was about to hand over something heavier than he wanted to. "She said, and I'm about as close to quoting her exact words as I can get, I don't even know if any of this was ever really about Grandpa. I think it was about the money the whole time, and I think I knew that, and I let myself not know it because I was scared of what came next if I let myself know it." I felt that land somewhere low in my chest, the particular ache of watching a suspicion you'd been holding at arm's length walk right up and introduce itself as fact. "She kept going," Josue said. "Told me Brayden's development company is in trouble. Real trouble, not the kind you fix with a good quarter. He borrowed against future phases of the project to cover cost overruns on the first one, borrowed from a man named Ronan Schneider out of Charleston. Private capital, not a bank. The kind of money that doesn't come with a grace period or a customer service line to call when you're running short.
How much?
$2 million. He said it flat, the way you'd read a number off a survey stake, no drama attached, because the number didn't need any help sounding as bad as it was. Due in full inside 3 weeks or Schneider takes controlling interest in Palmetto Coastal Development outright. Not a partnership, a takeover. Brayden loses the company he spent 5 years building, and from what Leilani told me, loses a good deal more than the company if Schneider decides the debt's worth collecting on some other way. I thought about the man Adonis had described in that back office. Tall 40s, good haircut, a watch he kept checking like it mattered more than the conversation. I hadn't put a name to him yet. I wondered sitting there whether I was about to. She cried the whole rest of the time I was there, Josue said. Kept saying she loved him, like saying it enough times might make it answer a question nobody'd actually asked her. I didn't push, didn't need to. She'd already told me the only thing that mattered, that whatever's driving this isn't simple greed dressed up as love. It's a man drowning, dragging his own wife under right along with him. And she's letting it happen because she's more afraid of being alone than she is of going down with him. The kitchen was quiet a long moment. Outside, the tide had turned somewhere out past the dark marsh, the way it does twice a day, whether anybody's watching or not. Patient and indifferent to whatever's falling apart on the land beside it. There's one more thing, Josue said, and something in his voice made me set my cup down. Schneider's not the forgiving type from what little I could dig up on him this evening. Man doesn't extend deadlines, doesn't take partial payment and call it good. If Brayden's 3 weeks out from a hard due date, that clock's running whether we do anything or not, and it might just be running faster than ours. I sat with that a long while before I answered him, turning it over the way I'd turn a boundary line that didn't sit square with the survey I already had in hand, checking it from every angle before I trusted myself to speak on it. You need to know something, Josue, I finally said, and I could hear how tired my own voice sounded saying it, tired in a way sleep wasn't going to fix. Before you go digging into Schneider any further, before either of us decides what to do about $2 million and a deadline that isn't ours, there's something sitting in that courthouse file I haven't told you yet. Something that might matter to this whole mess more than either one of us has let ourselves believe. Josue laid a photocopy of the file across his kitchen table, smoothing it flat with both hands, the way a man handles something he already suspects is going to change the shape of the room. The original stayed locked in Adonis's evidence cabinet, but the copy told the same story page for page in typewriter font gone faint with 60 years of sitting in a sealed box. Read it slow, Josue said. I already read it twice on the drive over, and I still don't think I've got the whole weight of it yet. The case wasn't Bradford versus the county, not really. That was just the caption on the outside. What sat inside was a 1961 quiet title action, my father, Josiah Bradford, against 3 of his own first cousins and a land speculation outfit out of Savannah that had convinced those cousins to file for a partition sale. 40 acres held as heirs' property since emancipation. No clean deed, no clear division, the kind of ownership speculators love best, because all it ever takes is one discouraged heir signing one bad piece of paper to force a courthouse auction on land the rest of the family never agreed to sell. My father had spent 11 months and money he didn't have proving something the county records had never bothered to prove for him, that the land had never actually passed down as shared heirs' property at all. His own grandfather had secured it through a private sale in 1894, deeded whole and clear to one man, one name. No siblings listed, no partition ever intended. Somewhere in the decades after, sloppy record-keeping and family assumption had let everybody start calling it heirs' property out of habit, the way land does sometimes when nobody corrects the story soon enough. The speculators had counted on that habit. My father had gone to court and proved the habit wrong. He won. Quiet title granted and sealed February of 1962. Sole ownership confirmed in his name alone, passing by his choosing, not by the county's assumption, not by a partition court, not by any cousin with a stranger's check in his coat pocket to whichever child he saw fit to leave it to. He left it to me. I sat with that a long moment, the compass heavy in my jacket pocket like it had gained weight sitting there. I took it out and set it on the table beside the photocopy, needle swinging once before it settled north, same as it always did, no matter what was happening around it. Boundaries protect, they don't divide. I understood the words differently now than I had 2 nights ago in this same kitchen. My father hadn't just protected a piece of ground. He'd protected it from the very people who shared his blood. Men and women who'd been talked into thinking a stranger's quick check was worth more than a family's unbroken claim. And then he'd carried that victory alone for the rest of his life, rather than let it become one more thing for the family to argue over.
He never told a soul, I said. Not his own wife, not me. He let 3 cousins believe for the rest of their lives that the land might have been theirs, rather than tell them outright it never was, and watch what that truth would do at every holiday table for the next 40 years.
Man made a hard call, Josue said quietly, and lived with the cost of it by himself. He made the same call I'm making right now. I heard myself say it before I'd fully decided I believed it. Leilani thinks this is heirs' property. Brayden thinks it's heirs' property. Half the family selling off shares to a shell company thinks they own something they've never legally held a single square foot of. I looked at the compass at the worn brass case at 60 years of one man's silence, sitting there disguised as a navigation tool. I could call her right now, tell her everything. End it tonight. You could, Josue agreed. Question is whether that's the truth doing the talking or just the hurt wanting company. I didn't answer that right away because I wasn't sure myself which one it was. Outside somewhere, down toward the water, an owl called twice and went quiet. The kind of sound that used to mean something to people who read the marsh for signs before they trusted anything a courthouse told them. If she's the woman I raised, I finally said, she'll find her own way to this truth before Brayden ever lets her see it handed to her by somebody else. And if she's not that woman anymore, if 2 years married to him has changed what she's willing to look away from, then I need to know that too before I hand her the one piece of leverage that could save this whole family or finish tearing it apart, depending on whose hands it lands in first. Josue studied me a long moment, the same look he used to give a deed he didn't fully trust. That's a hard thing to ask a man to sit on, Corbin, especially when the man sitting on it loves her. Loving her is exactly why I'm sitting on it, I said. And even as the words left my mouth, I heard my father in them, 60 years distant and closer than my own heartbeat. If she means it, if any part of her still means what I raised her to mean, she'll find her own way to this land's truth. And if I have to keep on being a dead man a while longer to give her the room to find it, then that's the price. I've buried harder things than my own name before. I folded the photocopy closed, tucked it beneath the compass on the table, and let the silence between Josue and me settle, the way tide settles once it's finished deciding which direction it's going to run. The fax machine in Josue's home office had been silent for so long I'd forgotten he still kept one, an old habit left over from decades of filing land documents with title companies that never fully trusted email. It started up a little after 10 that night, the machine's low mechanical groan pulling both of us out of the kitchen and down the hall before the first page had even finished printing. No cover sheet, no note. Just 4 pages sliding out one after another, and no caller ID on the little screen except a string of numbers that traced back when Josue tried calling them to a prepaid line that didn't accept incoming calls. We laid the pages out on his desk under the lamp. The top sheet was a quitclaim deed dated 3 weeks earlier purporting to transfer full ownership interest in the Bradford tract from Corbin Bradford to Brayden Stein and Leilani Dean jointly, in consideration of continued care and support. Beneath the transfer language sat a signature. My signature, or something built to look enough like it to pass a casual glance. Where would this have even come from? Josue said more to himself than to me, turning the page toward the lamp to catch the light at a different angle. 3 weeks ago, you were sitting in that facility, Corbin. You didn't sign anything. You barely signed your own meal tray. I studied the signature a long moment. It had the right slant, the right general shape somebody had clearly practiced off an old document to get the loops close. But my full legal name has never once carried a junior after it. My father was Josiah, not Corbin, and nobody who'd ever actually sat across a table from this family would make that mistake. It's the kind of small error a man only makes when he's learned a name off a property record instead of a person, when he's built an entire deed out of information he pulled from a database instead of a dinner table. Whoever built this deed had guessed at the Rest City lawyer careless the kind of mistake that only shows up if you already know the family well enough to catch it, and I'd spent 38 years of my working life catching exactly this kind of mistake in other men's paperwork. I laughed. One short breath of a laugh, no humor in it at all, the kind that comes out of a man's chest before he's decided how he actually feels about something. Josue looked up at the sound, surprised. "They put a junior on it," I said, and heard how strange my own voice sounded, flat and almost amused, when what I actually felt underneath it was something closer to a held breath. Man built a legal document meant to hand over 40 acres and 2 lives worth of history, and he didn't even bother learning my father's name first. That's not nothing to laugh about, Corbin. No, I agreed. And the laugh was already gone, folded back down into whatever place I kept things I didn't have room to feel just yet. It's not. Josue pulled the second page closer, a notary stamp dated the same day, signed by a name neither of us recognized. A mobile notary service out of Charleston that when Josue searched it on his phone, right there at the desk, turned out to be registered to an address that was nothing but a UPS mailbox rental. The third and fourth pages were copies of a power of attorney, backdated 18 months granting Brayden authority over my financial affairs that I had never once discussed, let alone signed. "This isn't sloppy family business anymore," Josue said quietly, setting the pages down and squaring their edges like he could straighten the whole situation out by hand if the paper lined upright. "This is forgery, notary fraud, elder financial exploitation if you want the statute number, and I can get you the statute number. This is enough to put somebody in a cell, Corbin, not just lose them a house." "Who signed off as the attorney handling it?" Josue flipped to the last page to a line at the bottom, listing the preparer of record. Bryson Peck, firm out of Charleston, does a lot of development and closing work along the coast. He tapped the signature line beside Peck's typed name. A real signature this time, not a forgery, but shaky in a way that didn't match the confident block letters of his name above it. Look at that hand, though. That's not a man signing off on routine paperwork. That's a man's hand doing something it doesn't want to be doing. I looked at it a long moment. There was something in that unsteady line that didn't sit easy with the rest of the document's careful, deliberate fraud, like one man had built the lie with confidence, and another man had signed his name to it with his conscience already fighting him on the way down. I didn't know yet what that meant. I only knew standing in Josue's office at 10:30 at night with 4 pages of forged paper spread out under a desk lamp that whatever hesitation lived in that trembling signature, it wasn't going to be enough on its own to undo what the rest of the document had already set in motion. "We need everybody," I said. "Trent, Kari, Adonis, if he can slip away from the courthouse without drawing attention." I gathered the 4 pages into a single stack, squared them the same way Josue had, though my hands weren't nearly as steady doing it as his had been. "This isn't a family disagreement to settle over Sunday dinner anymore, Josue. A man can talk his way out of greed. He can't talk his way out of a forged signature with a notary stamp attached to it. This is a crime that's plain and documented, and it needs treating like one." By Friday, Josue's kitchen table had stopped being a kitchen table and started being something closer to a war room. 4 chairs pulled up around it, and a stack of documents nobody outside that room was supposed to know existed. Trent McPherson arrived first, still moving with the same square-shouldered economy he'd carried through 30 years as Beaufort County's chief deputy. Retired 8 years now, but built like a man who could still chase somebody down if the occasion called for it. He set his coffee cup down exactly level with the table's edge, the way I imagine he used to set down evidence bags, and looked at the forged deed for a long moment without saying a word. Forgery, fraud, Elder exploitation? He counted them off on 3 fingers like he was reading a charge sheet out loud the way I supposed he had professionally, more times than either of us could count. That's a solid case sitting on this table, Corbin. Question is whether we want to build it in a courtroom or somewhere everybody in this county can watch it happen at once. Kari Lindsay came in a few minutes behind him, still in her work clothes from Lindsay Family Funeral Home, smelling faintly of lilies, the way she always did, no matter how many showers she took between viewings. She'd buried half the parents of everybody sitting at that table over the past 30 years, mine included, and she had the particular calm of a woman who'd long since stopped being rattled by anything the living could throw at her. "Carter found this," she said, sliding her phone across the table open to a glossy press release. "Palmetto Coastal Development. Groundbreaking ceremony Saturday morning. 40 confirmed investors. Catered breakfast remarks from the developer at 10 sharp. Media credentialed and welcome." Man's not hiding from attention, he's chasing it, which means he's about to hand us the biggest audience this family's ever had, and he's paying for the catering himself. Adonis slipped in last, 10 minutes late, still wearing his lanyard from the courthouse, like a man who hadn't quite decided whether he was still on the clock or not. He didn't sit. He stood behind Josue's chair, arms crossed, the posture of somebody who wanted plausible deniability about how deep into this he was letting himself get. "I can't be seen helping plan whatever this turns into," he said, "but I can tell you the courthouse archive keeps a certified copy process running 24 hours if you need an official stamped version of that 1961 order in hand by Saturday. Not a photocopy, something a judge would recognize on site." "Get us 2, Josue said. "One for Corbin to hold, one for whoever ends up needing to serve it as evidence before the day's over." The plan built itself slowly across that table over the next hour, each person laying down a piece the way you'd lay a foundation, course by course, checking each one square before setting the next on top of it. Trent would coordinate with 2 former colleagues still active on the force, quietly enough that nothing showed on a duty roster until it needed to. Kari would work the press angle, calling in a favor with a reporter from the Island Packet, who owed her one from a story she'd steered him away from running about a grieving family 3 years back. Carter would handle the ground logistics getting Corbin onto the site itself without drawing attention before the moment was right, parking timing, the small mechanics that decide whether a plan holds together or falls apart on contact with an actual crowd. "And me?" I asked, when the plan had mostly assembled itself around me, like scaffolding going up on a building I hadn't fully agreed to yet. "You walk in at the exact right second," Josue said. "Not a minute before, not a minute after. You let him finish whatever he's about to say to that room, every word of it, and then you hand him the truth in front of every camera Kari can get pointed his way." Trent leaned back in his chair, arms folded, studying the table like he was still deciding whether the whole plan held weight or whether it was going to buckle the first time real pressure landed on it. He'd spent 3 decades watching plans like this one fail in 100 small ways. A car that didn't start, a nerve that broke early, a witness who said too much too soon. "I've seen operations like this go sideways before," he said finally. "Usually because somebody got eager and moved before the moment was ready, or got scared and pulled back after it already started. There's no room in a plan like this for a second attempt. Man finds out once that we're coming for him, he lawyers up, he goes quiet, he buries every piece of paper Bryson Peck's firm ever touched. And we're left with nothing but a forged deed and a lot of righteous anger nobody in a courtroom's going to care about 6 months from now." He looked around the table at each of us in turn, landing last on me. "If we're doing this," Trent said, "we do it once, and we do it all the way. No half measures, no second chances. This has to work the first time, or it doesn't work at all." Nobody at that table argued with him. Nobody needed to. We all understood sitting there in Josue's kitchen with a groundbreaking ceremony 2 days out exactly what Trent was really telling us, that whatever we built over the next 48 hours had to be strong enough to hold a man's entire life underneath it, because we weren't going to get a chance to reinforce it after the weight came down. Josue's phone rang while we were still clearing the plans off his kitchen table. A Beaufort County number neither of us recognized. He answered it on the second ring, listened a moment, then mouthed a single word across the table at me. Choi, and reached over to switch the call onto speaker. Mr. Fry, this is Eva Choi, Adult Protective Services. You filed a complaint on behalf of an anonymous client regarding conditions at Marshview Assisted Living, specifically the private wing displacement policy. I did, Josue said. You get out there. This afternoon. I could hear paper shuffling on her end, the particular rustle of somebody flipping through a legal pad full of handwritten notes. I want to be careful about what I say on an open call, but I'll tell you this much. Whatever your client reported to us, it wasn't an overreaction. I leaned in closer to the phone without fully meaning to, the way a man leans toward bad weather on the horizon, even though leaning doesn't change what's coming. I sat down with the facility director, a Ms. Crystal Reed, Eva went on. Asked to see the maintenance work order for the plumbing repair that supposedly required moving residents out of the private wing 3 weeks back. She couldn't produce one. Not a delay, not an excuse. She genuinely could not locate a single work order because, as far as I can tell, no plumbing repair was ever scheduled, ordered, or performed in that wing during the window she claims it happened. So there was no repair, Josue said. There was no repair, Eva confirmed. I asked her directly why a resident was moved out of a paid private suite and into general population housing without documented cause. That's when things got interesting. She paused long enough that I heard Josue glance at me, both of us waiting on the same breath. She had a spiral notebook on her desk, Eva said. Not a facility log, a personal one, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore. The second I asked my question, she reached over and slid it under a stack of intake forms, casual as anything, like she thought I hadn't watched her do it. I asked to see it. She told me it was personal. I explained that under the authority of an active APS investigation, personal notebooks, kept in a resident's file room during business hours, don't stay personal for very long, and I'd be requesting it formally through the state's office if she didn't produce it voluntarily. Did she? Not today. She got flustered, Mr. Fry. And I mean genuinely flustered, hands shaking, couldn't find her words, kept starting sentences about temporary administrative adjustments and not finishing them. I've done this work 11 years. I know what a nervous director looks like when she's covering for an honest paperwork mistake, and I know what one looks like when she's sitting on something she's terrified is about to come out. This was the second kind. Eva let that sit a moment before she went on. For what it's worth, I've sat across from a lot of people who were simply overwhelmed, understaffed, doing their best with too little. Ms. Reed didn't read that way to me. She read like a woman doing arithmetic in her head the whole time she was talking to me, trying to figure out how much I already knew before she decided how much to admit. I thought about Crystal Reed's face the day she'd told me about the plumbing repair, the smile that hadn't reached past her teeth, and felt something cold and steady settle into place where uncertainty had been sitting before. What happens now? Josue asked. I've requested her financial and billing records for the past 2 years, along with staff scheduling logs for the night in question, the night your client reportedly left the facility unsupervised, which is its own separate violation worth investigating on its own merits. I'll also be subpoenaing that notebook if she doesn't turn it over by end of week. Eva's voice shifted slightly, something more careful entering it. Mr. Fry, I don't want to speculate beyond what I've confirmed, but a facility director who can't produce a work order for a repair that never happened, who's hiding a personal ledger the second a state investigator asks a direct question, that's not the profile of somebody making an honest mistake. That's the profile of somebody being paid to make a problem disappear and getting nervous about who might be asking who did the paying. Nobody said anything for a moment. Out past the kitchen window, the tide had started pulling back out toward evening, same patient rhythm it always kept no matter what conversations were happening on the land beside it. I'll keep your office updated as this develops, Eva said. And Mr. Fry, tell your client, whoever they are, that filing this complaint was the right call. Whatever's in that notebook, we're going to find out what it says. It's just a matter of how much longer Ms. Reed wants to hold on to it before somebody makes her let go. The call ended. Josue set the phone down on the table between us, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Both of us doing the same silent arithmetic. A notebook Crystal Reed was scared enough to hide from a state investigator. A nursing home director who'd moved me out of my own room for no documented reason at all. And a groundbreaking ceremony now less than 48 hours away that was about to bring every one of these threads into the same room at the same time. The envelope showed up in Josue's mailbox sometime between dusk and full dark. No postage, no return address, just a plain white rectangle wedged behind the flag. Like it had been placed there by somebody who knew exactly when the mail carrier had already come and gone for the day. Inside was a prepaid phone powered off and a single index card, in handwriting too careful to be casual. 9 o'clock. Come alone. I didn't come alone. Josue sat 2 rooms over with the lights off, close enough to reach me if something went wrong, far enough that whoever called wouldn't hear him breathing on the line. I sat at the kitchen table with the compass in front of me, turned it once under my palm, watched the needle settle north the way it always did, and waited for the phone to ring. It rang at 9 exactly. Mr. Bradford. The voice was even unhurried, the kind of voice that had never once needed to raise itself to get what it wanted. You don't know me. My name is Ronan Schneider. I said nothing. I'd learned enough about silence over the past week to know it could do more work than a question sometimes. I understand you've had a busy few days, Schneider went on. A quiet title case nobody's supposed to know about. A forged deed with your name misspelled on it. A groundbreaking ceremony this Saturday that I imagine several people are currently building a great deal of careful choreography around. A pause, deliberate, letting the weight of how much he already knew settle into the silence on my end. I'm not calling to interfere with your choreography, Mr. Bradford. I'm calling because our interests, as it happens, run in the same direction, even if we arrived here by entirely different roads. I don't know you, I said, and I don't do business with men who deliver phones through mailboxes instead of knocking on doors like anybody with nothing to hide. Fair, he said. And I heard something that might have been the ghost of amusement in it. I extended Brayden Stein $2 million 11 months ago, secured against future phases of a development I was assured was fully collateralized and moving on schedule. Neither of those things turned out to be entirely true. I've spent the past 6 weeks having his finances gone through by people considerably better at forensic accounting than the men he hired to hide them from me. And I found something I think you'll want to hear, given what I understand you're planning for Saturday morning. Papers shifted somewhere on his end, the small sound of a man consulting notes he already knew by heart, but liked to have in front of him anyway. Roughly $400,000 of the money I lent him for cost overruns on Phase 1 never touched Phase 1 at all. It went instead into a private placement, a speculative land venture 2 counties over, something called Tidewater Ventures, structured through a shell that traces back, after some very determined digging, to Brayden Stein personally. I sat very still. $400,000 quietly siphoned out of a loan meant to save a company and poured instead into something meant to enrich the one man borrowing it. He was betting my money on a second horse, Schneider said, while telling me it was all riding on the first one. I don't particularly care about your land dispute, Mr. Bradford. I don't care about heirs' property or forged deeds or whatever moral reckoning you're planning to deliver at that ceremony. I care that Brayden Stein lied to my face about where $2 million of my capital went, and I intend to be standing somewhere he can see me when the truth of that catches up with him. Why call me? Why not just collect what you're owed and let the rest sort itself out? Because a quiet collection helps nobody but me, Schneider said. A public one at the right moment in front of the exact investors he's currently courting for Phase 2 that ruins him thoroughly enough that he never gets the chance to do this to somebody else's money again. I have a certain appetite for thoroughness, Mr. Bradford. I suspect, given everything you've apparently done this past week to get a sealed courthouse file reopened, that you might share it. I thought about Trent's warning around Josue's kitchen table 2 nights before. No half measures, no second chances. And now a stranger with 2 million reasons of his own was telling me, calm as a man discussing weather, that he had his own clock running and his own reasons for wanting Saturday to go a very particular way. A clock that answered to nobody's careful choreography but his own. "You planning to move before Saturday?" I asked. "Or after?" "That," Schneider said, "depends entirely on whether I believe your plan is actually going to work. I don't enjoy being kept waiting, Mr. Bradford, and I don't extend patience as a courtesy. I extend it as an investment. Right now, I'm still deciding whether investing in your timeline is worth more to me than simply handling this myself tonight on my own terms." The line went dead before I could answer him. I sat there a long moment with the disconnected phone still in my hand and the compass beside it on the table needle steady, indifferent to how much the ground beneath the rest of my plan had just shifted. Ronan Schneider didn't need me to win anything. He only needed Brayden to lose on whatever schedule suited him best, and if his schedule and mine happened to disagree, I had no reason at all to believe he'd be the one who bent. I sat at Josue's kitchen table a long while after the line to Ronan Schneider went dead, turning the compass over in my hands, cleaning a smear of thumbprint off the brass casing with the hem of my shirt before I slid it back into my jacket pocket. Some habits a man keeps not because they're useful, but because the keeping of them is the only thing steady enough to hold on to while everything else moves. Josue came in from the back room where he'd been listening already, reaching for a legal pad. "You heard all that?" "Every word. Schneider's not a man we can just leave sitting out there with his own clock running," Josue said. "Man like that doesn't wait politely for other people's plans to catch up to his patience. Then we don't leave him out there." I'd already turned the idea over twice by the time I said it out loud. "We bring him in. Send word through that same phone, tell him if he wants to see Brayden ruined thoroughly, publicly, in front of every investor who matters to a man like that, Saturday morning is the room to be standing in. Let him have his moment, same as the rest of us. Man wants an audience for his own reckoning, we'll make sure he gets one that serves both of us, instead of neither." Josue studied me a moment, then nodded slowly, already writing. "Better a partner you can predict than a loose thread you can't." By the time Trent Kyrie and Carter arrived the next morning, the plan had tightened into something with real edges, instead of just intentions. We spread everything back across the kitchen table, the certified copy of the 1961 order Adonis had pushed through overnight, the forged deed with its careless junior, Eva Choi's preliminary notes on Crystal Reed, and now folded into the pile, confirmation that Ronan Schneider would be standing somewhere in that crowd Saturday morning with his own set of facts loaded and ready. "Walk me through positions one more time," Trent said, tapping the table like he was reading off a duty roster. "Where's everybody standing when Corbin makes his move?" "Carter gets me onto the grounds through the catering entrance 20 minutes before the ceremony starts," I said. "I stay near the tent poles at the back out of Brayden's sightline until he's finished his remarks, not a second before." "I'll be positioned with the investors," Kari said, "close enough to the reporter from the island packet that I can point her camera the instant things start moving far enough that nobody thinks to ask why the local funeral director's standing shoulder to shoulder with the press. I'll have 2 men in plain clothes near the parking area," Trent said, "and I'll be near the front myself, close enough to step in if Stein does anything stupider than talking. Man's about to lose everything in front of 40 people with cameras. Desperate men make desperate choices, and I intend to be standing close enough to stop one before it starts." "And Schneider?" Carter asked. "Standing wherever Schneider decides to stand," I said. "That's a man who doesn't take direction well, and I didn't ask him to. I only asked him to wait until the moment's ready before he lets go of whatever he's holding. What he does after that is his business." Josue slid the certified copy of the 1961 order across the table toward me, along with a second folder, the forged deed, the notary fraud, the backdated power of attorney, everything Bryson Peck's office had built, and everything that was about to come apart because of one small, careless mistake with a name. "You carry both," he said, "the truth of what you own and the proof of what he tried to steal. Let him see both at once. Let there be no room in that man's head to pretend he's confused about which is which." I took the folders. They weighed almost nothing. Two thin stacks of paper, and yet holding them in my hands felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. Heavier than the compass. Heavier than the grief I'd been keeping folded away since Emmeline. Heavier even than the silence I'd been keeping from Leilani. For longer than I wanted to admit out loud. "There's still time to change course," Josue said quietly, watching my face the way he did when he suspected a client was about to make a decision they hadn't fully sat with yet. "Nobody at this table would think less of you for calling Leilani tonight instead, telling her privately, sparing her whatever's about to happen in front of a room full of strangers and cameras." I thought about that a long moment, about the girl who used to fall asleep on the hallway floor outside her grandmother's sewing room, about the woman I'd watched through oak branches with her hand resting flat on a cedar chest she couldn't quite bring herself to open. Some part of me wanted exactly what Josue was offering, the quiet mercy of a private phone call instead of a public reckoning. But my father had carried a harder truth than this one alone for 60 years. And the compass in my pocket had never once needed anybody's mercy to keep pointing true. "No," I said. "If she's going to understand what almost got taken from this family, she needs to see it get taken back in the open same way it was almost lost. Private mercy doesn't teach a lesson loud enough to outlast the next man who comes along trying the same thing." Trent closed the folder in front of him and looked around the table one final time, the same steady look he must have given 100 briefings over 30 years of service. "Tomorrow," he said, 10 o'clock. "There's no pulling back now." Carter got me through the catering entrance a little after 9:30 past a folding table stacked with chafing dishes and a nervous young server who never once looked up from the shrimp and grits she was arranging into careful rows. I kept my cap low and my collar up, an old man in a borrowed windbreaker moving slow enough to look like part of the setup crew instead of the reason 40 people were about to have their morning ruined. The site itself sat on the marsh edge of my own family's land, a raw stretch of cleared ground where oak trees had stood 2 months earlier, now dressed up with a white event tent, rented, folding chairs in careful rows, and a small stage with a podium bearing a logo I'd never asked anyone's permission to use. Champagne sat chilling in silver buckets along a linen-draped table. Somewhere near the front, a string quartet tuned up like this was a wedding instead of a theft, dressed in bunting. I found my place near the tent poles at the back, half-shadowed, close enough to see everything, and close enough, if I needed it, to disappear. Carter drifted off toward the parking area to keep watch the way Trent had assigned him. I stood alone with 2 folders under my jacket and a compass in my pocket, and watched the investors arrive in 2s and 3s, men in linen blazers and women in sundresses, laughing at things that weren't especially funny. The particular easy laughter of people who'd already decided the morning was going to go their way. Brayden arrived last, the way men like Brayden always arrived last-timed, so every head turned when he stepped out of his car. He wore a pale gray suit that probably cost more than most of the folding chairs combined, and he moved through the crowd, shaking hands, touching shoulders, laughing at his own jokes a half-second before anybody else caught up to them. I watched Leilani trail a few steps behind him in a cream-colored dress, her smile fixed in place like something she'd practiced in a mirror that morning and hadn't quite managed to make convincing. Near the back of the seated rows, a man I didn't recognize took a chair off to one side, apart from the main cluster of investors dressed plainly compared to the rest of the crowd. Dark suit, no tie, a watch. He checked once and didn't check again. He didn't clap when Brayden waved to the crowd. He simply watched, the way a man watches a house he's already decided he's going to own, regardless of who's currently living in it. I didn't need an introduction to know I was looking at Ronan Schneider. He caught my eye once briefly across the whole width of that tent and gave me the smallest possible nod and acknowledgement between 2 men who'd agreed, without ever quite trusting each other, to let this morning unfold on the same timeline. At 10 o'clock sharp, Brayden climbed the small stage and tapped the microphone twice, the sound cracking out over the tent like distant thunder. "Thank you all for being here," he began, and the crowd settled champagne glasses, lowering phones, lifting to record. This is more than a groundbreaking. This is the beginning of something this stretch of coastline has been waiting 100 years for. He talked for a while about vision, about legacy, about honoring the land's history while building something worthy of its future. Words I recognized as the particular hollow music men use when they want a room full of strangers to feel generous about handing over their money. The kind of speech built entirely out of borrowed weight, none of it his own. He gestured toward the marsh, toward the dock my father had rebuilt with his own hands, the summer I turned 16, and called it an untouched natural asset finally ready to be shared with the world. There were, of course, some difficult family decisions along the way, he said, and here his voice dropped into something practiced and somber, the tone of a man performing grief he'd never actually carried. My wife's grandfather, Corbin Bradford, passed only recently, a hard loss for this family, but I truly believe that he'd be proud to see this land finally reaching its full potential, rather than sitting idle the way it has for generations. Somewhere near the front, I saw Leilani's hand tighten around the stem of her champagne glass, though her face didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, folders pressed against my ribs beneath my jacket, and let every word land the way Trent had told me to let it land, without a single flinch, without giving away 1 second early that the dead man he was eulogizing was standing 40 feet behind him with the paperwork to prove every word of that speech was a lie. Brayden lifted his glass high, catching the morning light so it flashed gold across the crowd. "The Bradford land," he said, letting the words carry, letting them settle into every recording device pointed his way, "is officially ours." The applause came up around him like a wave breaking all at once, 40 investors on their feet, champagne glasses lifted high, the string quartet sliding into something bright and triumphant, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise I watched Ronan Schneider check his watch one more time, unhurried, patient, a man simply waiting his turn. I stepped out from beside the tent pole folders held tight against my ribs and started walking slowly toward the stage. I walked slow. I'd decided that much beforehand sitting at Josue's kitchen table the night before. Not a rush, not a stagger, just the steady, unhurried pace of a man crossing his own front yard. Because that's exactly what I was doing. Whatever the deed Brayden had just waved at the crowd tried to claim otherwise. 38 years of walking property lines teaches a man how to cover ground without ever looking like he's in a hurry to get anywhere. And I put every one of those years into that walk across the grass. Somebody near the front saw me first. A woman in a yellow sundress, mid-sip on her champagne glass, frozen halfway to her lips, eyes going wide and then wider. She elbowed the man beside her. He turned. Then the turning spread backward through the crowd like a current finding the path of least resistance, row by row, chair by chair, until the applause thinned and stumbled and finally died out into something closer to a held breath. Near the front, I saw Leilani turn last of anybody, following the direction of every other set of eyes in that tent, and I watched her champagne glass slip half an inch in her fingers before she caught it. Brayden was still smiling at the crowd, riding the high of his own applause when he noticed the shift happening behind him and turned to see what everyone else was looking at. I watched the color leave his face in stages. First confusion, then disbelief. Then something closer to the particular blank terror of a man watching a fact walk toward him that his whole morning had been built on being false. He stopped, started again. "That's not possible. Your crystal read confirmed it. There's a death certificate. I have the paperwork." "You have paperwork you paid a woman to falsify," I said, still walking, still unhurried. "Same as you paid a man to build the deed sitting in that folder under my arm. I've spent a career reading paperwork other men hoped nobody would check closely enough to catch. I checked yours." I reached the base of the small stage and climbed the 2 steps without hurrying, the folders steady under my arm, the compass a small, solid weight in my jacket pocket that I could feel with every step like a second heartbeat. Somewhere off to my left, a camera shutter clicked once, then again, then settled into a rapid, continuous stutter as every phone and lens in that tent turned itself toward the stage. I set the folders down on the podium in front of him. Then I reached into my jacket, took out the compass and set it down on top of them, brass catching the morning light the same way it had caught lamplight in Josue's kitchen a dozen nights running. The tent had gone fully silent now. No music, no conversation. Just the faint hush of marsh wind moving through canvas, and somewhere far off, a gull calling once over water that didn't care one way or another who owned the land beside it. Brayden stared at the compass like he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his eyes moved to the folders, then back to me. "Whose land, son?" I asked him. 4 words. I'd practiced saying them exactly that plain, exactly that quiet, because Trent had told me the quietest question in a room always lands the hardest. And I understood now, standing there, that he'd been right. Brayden didn't answer. His mouth opened, nothing came out of it. I reached down, opened the top folder myself, and turned it to face him, laying it flat on the podium between us for the whole crowd, and every camera in that tent to see clearly. The certified seal caught the light. Bradford versus the County of Beaufort, 1961. Quiet title granted in full sole ownership confirmed. "That land you just told 40 people belongs to you," I said, "has never belonged to anybody but a Bradford, not shared, not divided, not up for sale by cousins who never held a legal claim to sell in the first place. My father proved that in a courtroom 63 years ago and never told a soul because he understood something you never bothered learning before you built an entire company on a lie about who I was and what I owned." Brayden reached out and picked up the folder with both hands, and I watched his fingers not quite hold steady against the paper, a small, telling tremor moving through them, the way wind moves through marsh grass right before a storm actually arrives. For a long moment, nobody in that tent moved at all. No applause, no gasp, just 40 investors, a string quartet with their instruments lowered halfway, and a wall of camera lenses, all of them waiting to see what a man does with his hands and his face in the exact second his entire morning collapses underneath him. The wind picked up off the marsh and pushed once through the open sides of the tent, lifting the edge of the tablecloth on the champagne table, rattling one loose tent pole somewhere behind me. A gull called again, farther off this time. Somewhere in the second row, a woman's high heel shifted against the grass with a small, sharp sound that seemed, in that silence, louder than it had any right to be. Somewhere behind all of it, I heard a single camera shutter click one more time, sharp and final, like a door closing on whatever version of this story Brayden had been planning to tell. Brayden's eyes moved across the page the way a man reads something he's desperately hoping will rearrange itself into different words if he just looks hard enough. His lips moved slightly silent, tracing the legal language quiet title, sole ownership granted in full, like repetition alone might loosen its grip on what it actually meant. "This is," he looked up at me, then out at the crowd, then back down at the page. "This is 60 years old. Records like this get superseded, overturned. There are appeals processes. There's nothing to appeal," I said. "Quiet title actions don't expire, and nobody in 63 years has ever filed to challenge it because nobody besides my father and now me ever knew it existed. You didn't inherit a disputed claim, Brayden. You built an entire company launch on top of land you never had a single legal right to promise anyone." A ripple moved through the front rows. Phone still recording, but the angle of every lens had shifted, now less interested in Brayden's face and more interested in mine, in the folder, in whatever was about to happen next in a morning that had already gone somewhere none of them had paid to attend. Somewhere in that ripple, I caught a glimpse of the reporter Kari had promised me, notebook already out, pen moving fast across the page without her once looking down at it. "You're lying," Brayden said, and I heard the pitch of his voice climb half a register, the particular strain of a man reaching for outrage, because outrage was easier to perform than fear. "This is some kind of scheme. You and Josue Fry cooked this up together. Everybody knows he's been sniffing around this family's business for years, looking for an angle." The seal on that document was applied by a Beaufort County judge in 1962, I said, keeping my voice level, keeping it the same quiet pitch I'd used to ask him whose land it was. "You're welcome to call the courthouse yourself and verify it." Adonis Castillo will be at his desk by noon. Behind Brayden near the edge of the seated rows, a man in a seersucker jacket stood up quietly, said something low to the woman beside him, and began walking toward the parking area without waiting to see how the rest of the morning played out. Then a second investor followed, then a third, the exodus starting slow and gathering the particular momentum of people who'd suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Brayden saw them going. I watched something in his face change when he did. Not the anger from a moment before, but something closer to the raw arithmetic of a man watching his own future walk away from him in 2s and 3s, calculating in real time how many of those 40 people he still needed and how few of them he was likely to keep. His jaw worked once, twice, like a man chewing on words that kept refusing to arrange themselves into anything useful. "Wait," he said louder now, addressing the retreating backs more than he was addressing me. "Wait, this doesn't change anything about Phase 2, about the timeline, about—" "Mr. Stein." The voice came from the crowd itself, calm and unhurried, cutting through his sentence the way a scalpel cuts through something already weakened. Eva Choi stepped out from among the folding chairs, a manila folder of her own tucked under one arm, moving toward the stage with the same steady authority I imagined she carried into every home she'd ever had to walk into on official business. Brayden turned toward her, momentarily thrown by a face he didn't recognize among a crowd of investors he did. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Eva Choi, Adult Protective Services, Beaufort County." She climbed the 2 steps to the stage without asking permission, stopping a few feet from where I stood, close enough now that I could see the folder in her hands was thick, well-organized, tabbed, with color-coded flags along the edges. "I've spent the past week investigating conditions at Marshview Assisted Living, following an anonymous complaint regarding the unauthorized transfer of a resident. This resident," she added with a small nod toward me, "out of paid private care and into general population housing absent any documented medical or facility reason." The remaining crowd had gone almost entirely quiet now, whatever fragments of the celebration still lingering in the air finally extinguished completely. "During that investigation," Eva continued, opening her folder just enough to glance down at a page without fully revealing it, "I obtained financial records indicating a series of payments made to Marshview's facility director, Crystal Reed, over the past 2 months. The payments originated from an account associated with Palmetto Coastal Development." She looked up, meeting Brayden's eyes directly for the first time. "Your company, Mr. Stein." Brayden's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it, same as it had in the few minutes before when I'd asked him whose land he thought he was standing on. Eva stepped up beside me, close enough now that the 2 of us stood shoulder to shoulder facing him, the compass and the folders still sitting between us on the podium, catching the light. "I think," she said quietly enough that it carried further than any shout could have managed in that particular silence, "you have a great deal more to answer for this morning than a mistake about a deed." She let the folder rest against her hip unhurried. A woman who'd clearly learned a long time ago that the worst news doesn't need to be shouted to land. Brayden's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, fumbling for his phone with the particular clumsy urgency of a drowning man reaching for anything that floats. "I need to call my attorney," he said mostly to himself, already thumbing through his contacts. "Bryson will clear this up. Bryson handled all of this. He'll have documentation. He won't." Josue's voice came from the base of the stage steps, and I turned to see him climbing up beside me, a slim folder of his own in hand, the same unhurried pace the rest of us had learned to move with that morning. He'd been standing near the back the whole time, close enough to watch, patient enough to wait for the exact moment his piece of this needed to land. I hadn't known walking into that tent exactly when Josue meant to step forward, only that he would, the same way I'd trusted every other piece of that morning's careful choreography to arrive when it was supposed to. "I placed a call to Bryson Peck's firm yesterday afternoon," Josue said, addressing the crowd as much as Brayden now, his voice carrying easy and clear across the quiet tent. Standard professional courtesy, letting opposing counsel know a quiet title matter had resurfaced that would affect a transaction his firm had prepared documents for. Except, when I asked to speak with Mr. Peck directly, I was informed he was no longer counsel of record for Palmetto Coastal Development. Brayden's thumb stopped moving over his phone screen. That's not he's still my attorney. We spoke Tuesday. You may have spoken to him Tuesday, Josue said. But according to his own firm's filing with the state bar, Bryson Peck formally withdrew as counsel of record for your company exactly 7 days ago. Cited professional conscience concerns in the withdrawal letter, which is about as close as a practicing attorney ever comes to telling the world without quite saying it outright that he no longer believed in what his client was asking him to sign his name to. I felt something click into place, a piece I'd been carrying without a shape to put it in since that afternoon in Adonis's back office. Tall 40s, good haircut, a watch he kept checking. A man who'd come asking how much it would cost to make a courthouse file disappear and left calm as anything when the answer was no. It was him, I said mostly to myself, though the words carried in that silence same as everything else had. Bryson Peck was the man who tried to bribe Adonis Castillo 3 weeks ago. Not a hired investigator, not somebody working freelance. Your own attorney trying to make my father's court order vanish before either one of us ever knew it existed. Josue nodded slowly. I'd wager that's exactly why he withdrew when the bribe didn't take. A man builds a fraud he can live with right up until the moment it asks him to break the law outright with his own hands on the record in a courthouse with cameras in the hallway. Some men keep going past that line. Others find out right at that line they're not actually built for it. Which means, Eva Choi added quietly, still standing beside me, folder resting against her hip. Whatever paperwork got prepared in this past week, the quitclaim deed, the power of attorney, the notarized transfer, none of it had a licensed attorney's oversight behind it at all. You've been operating without counsel, Mr. Stein, for 7 days, right through the exact period you filed a fraudulent deed and forged an elderly man's signature on a legal document. She said it plainly, without any particular relish, the way a woman states a fact she's already fully confirmed, rather than one she's still trying to prove. A few more chairs scraped back in the crowd behind us, more investors choosing quietly to be somewhere else, though I no longer bothered counting how many. The number hardly mattered anymore. What mattered was watching Brayden understand in real time that the room he'd built his entire morning around had already finished emptying itself out from underneath him. Brayden looked down at the phone still in his hand, then dialed anyway, thumb pressing the screen with a kind of stubborn desperation, lifting it to his ear in front of 40 investors and a reporter's notebook and every camera still trained on that stage. Bryson, he said into the phone too loud, the particular loudness of a man who already suspects nobody is going to answer, but needs the crowd to watch him try anyway. Bryson, pick up. I need you to call me back right now. This isn't pick up the phone. Nothing came back but the flat, mechanical silence of a call nobody intended to take, stretching out long enough that even the investors who'd stayed could hear it long enough that Brayden finally lowered the phone from his ear and stood there holding it, staring at the screen like it had personally betrayed him. I watched something settle into his face in that silence. Not the outrage from before, not even the fear. Something closer to the particular loneliness of a man realizing all at once and far too late that every ally he thought he'd built around himself had already quietly stepped back from the blast radius days before the explosion actually arrived, leaving him standing alone at the center of it, with nothing left to hold but a phone that wasn't going to ring, and a crowd that had already started deciding one folding chair at a time that they'd seen quite enough of Brayden Stein for one Saturday morning. Ronan Schneider rose from his chair at the edge of the seated rows, the way a man rises when he has never once in his life needed to hurry to be noticed. He buttoned his jacket unhurried and walked toward the stage with the same unbothered patience he'd worn since I first spotted him that morning checking his watch, waiting his turn. The crowd parted slightly to let him through, though nobody seemed entirely sure who he was yet, whispers passing chair to chair, asking the same question in different words. Brayden turned at the sound of footsteps on the grass, and I watched recognition hit him, a half-second before the dread that followed it. The particular expression of a man seeing the one person in the world he'd hoped would never stand in the same room as his investors on the one morning he'd most needed that hope to hold. Ronan. Brayden's voice cracked slightly on the name. This isn't, I can explain the timing on the transfer, the collateral's still solid, phase 2 projections are... I'm not here for projections, Schneider said. His voice carried without effort, flat and even, the same tone he'd used on the phone 2 nights before. And it silenced the tent more completely than either of the previous confrontations had managed. I'm here because 11 months ago, I loaned Palmetto Coastal Development $2 million secured against cost overruns on phase 1 of this project. Fully collateralized, I was told. Every dollar accounted for. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document of his own unhurried and held it up for the crowd rather than handing it to Brayden directly. $400,000 of that loan never touched phase 1, Schneider said. It moved instead into a private placement called Tidewater Ventures, a speculative land deal 2 counties from here, structured through a shell entity that traces back after a fairly straightforward paper trail to Mr. Stein personally. He let that sit a moment, unhurried, watching it land the way a man watches a demolition charge do exactly the job it was built to do. You borrowed my money to save your company and quietly gambled 1/5 of it on yourself instead. That's not... Brayden's voice had lost whatever confidence it started the morning with, entirely, now thin and unsteady. That was a bridge investment. It was going to pay back into the project once it matured. It wasn't... It doesn't matter what you intended to do with stolen collateral, Schneider said, and for the first time that morning something sharpened in his voice, not louder, just harder, like a blade finding an edge. It matters what you actually did. You lied to me about where my money went. You lied to these investors about owning land you never had legal claim to, and apparently, he added with the smallest glance toward Eva Choi, you lied to a state agency about the circumstances under which an elderly man was moved out of his own care facility. I don't particularly care which of those lies troubles this crowd most. I only care that a man who lies this comprehensively, this consistently, isn't a partner I extend patience to any further. He turned toward the remaining investors, most of them now standing phones, still recording, none of them making a single sound. I'll be filing to call the full loan amount due effective immediately, Schneider said. Along with a fraud claim against Mr. Stein personally, given that the misappropriated funds move through an account he controls directly rather than through the company itself. I'd encourage anyone else with capital currently exposed to Palmetto Coastal Development to consult their own counsel before this morning is finished. Brayden stood there in the middle of it, the reporter's pen still moving, the camera still trained on his face, Eva Choi's folder still open at her hip, my father's 63-year-old court order still sitting on the podium beside a compass that had outlasted every lie told about it. And I watched something in him finally give way entirely, the last structural piece of whatever confidence had carried him through that morning's opening remarks, buckling, all at once under weight it was never built to hold. His knees didn't fully collapse, but he sagged one hand, catching the edge of the podium to steady himself, head dropping forward. The posture of a man who has run out of directions to turn and finally stopped trying to find one. Nobody moved to help him. Not the investors who remained, most of them already halfway to their cars in every way that mattered, even while their feet stayed planted. Not Leilani, still standing frozen near the front row, her champagne glass long since abandoned on an empty chair beside her. Both hands now pressed flat against her stomach, like she was holding something in that wanted badly to come out. Not even me, though some old worn-down piece of me. The piece that had once taught a girl to ride a bicycle down this exact stretch of gravel. The piece that still remembered what it felt like to want the best for the man his granddaughter had chosen, found itself surprised by how little satisfaction the sight of him folding actually delivered. I had expected somewhere in the planning of all this to feel something closer to triumph. What I felt instead was closer to exhaustion. The tent stayed silent around him, waiting the way a house waits after the last board finally comes loose from a wall that's been failing for longer than anybody wanted to admit. Brayden lifted his head slowly, and I watched his eyes move across what remained of that tent the way a drowning man's eyes move across open water, searching for anything that might still hold his weight. Ronan Schneider stood unmoved, arms folded, already a closed door. Eva Choi's folder sat open and waiting a second closed door. Josue, myself, the compass, the certified seal, every direction Brayden turned, offered him nothing but more proof of exactly how thoroughly the morning had already finished with him. His eyes landed on Leilani. I saw it happen before he said a word, some old survival instinct taking over where reason had already abandoned him. The particular calculation of a man who has run out of true things to say and has decided in the space of half a second that a lie aimed at somebody else might buy him more room to breathe than the truth ever could. "It was her," Brayden said. The words landed strange in that silence, too loud, too sudden, and for a moment, nobody in the tent seemed entirely sure they'd heard him correctly. Even the reporter's pen stopped moving for half a second before it caught back up, as if her hand had needed that long to believe what her ears had just registered. "Leilani?" he said again, louder now, turning fully toward her, one arm lifting to point across the grass at the woman he'd married 2 years before. "She's the one who told me the land was heir's property. She's the one who said it wouldn't matter if we moved things along a little faster with the family shares. She's the one who said her grandfather was practically gone anyway, that it would be a mercy to let the paperwork catch up before he actually—" "Stop!" Leilani's voice cracked on the word thin and raw, the first thing she'd said out loud since the ceremony began unraveling around her. Brayden didn't stop. Whatever dignity had carried him through the earlier parts of that morning was gone now, burned away entirely, leaving only the raw animal logic of a cornered man reaching for anything within arm's length to throw between himself and what was coming. "She has a law degree. She knew exactly what these documents meant when she signed off on them. I'm not the one who understood the legal language here. I trusted her. I trusted my own wife to tell me what was actually—" "That's not true." Leilani's voice found more strength on the second try, though it still shook. "You know that's not true, Brayden." "Is it?" He turned back toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward the reporter still writing everything down. "Ask her about the paperwork. Ask her what she knew and when she knew it. I'm not the villain everybody's decided I am this morning. I'm a man who got played by his own wife, same as you're all about to find out." I watched Leilani's face during all of it, watched something break open behind her eyes that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a particular kind of devastation I recognized because I'd carried a version of it myself once a long time ago. The moment you finally see with total clarity that somebody you loved was never going to protect you the way you'd spent years assuming they would. She didn't argue further. She didn't defend herself to the crowd, didn't turn to the cameras, didn't reach for any of the tools a woman with her training would ordinarily have reached for without thinking. She just stood there, hands still pressed flat against her stomach, and turned her head slowly away from her husband, away from the stage, away from Ronan Schneider and Eva Choi and every camera still recording, until her eyes found mine across the width of that quiet tent. She looked at me the way a child looks at a parent after falling somewhere they'd been warned not to climb, not asking for rescue exactly, past the age of expecting that kind of rescue was still owed to her, but looking anyway, the way the body looks toward home, even after the mind has stopped believing home is where safety actually lives. It was the same look I remembered from a hallway floor years ago, a girl waiting outside a sewing room door for somebody to finish what they were doing and simply noticed she was there. She didn't say anything. I don't think there was anything left in her, standing there, that could have formed itself into words. The cameras kept recording, patient and indifferent, capturing a silence that would end up saying more about that morning than either Brayden's accusation or my own confrontation ever had. Somewhere behind us, I heard Trent shift his weight, the small sound of a man deciding whether the moment called for him to step forward. I lifted one hand slightly at my side, not quite a gesture, just enough to tell him to wait. Whatever needed to happen next wasn't going to happen through me stepping in to rescue her. Not yet. Not like this, not in front of 40 investors and a reporter's camera. If Leilani was ever going to find her own way back to solid ground, it wasn't going to start with somebody else doing the walking for her. I held her gaze a moment longer, long enough, I hoped, for her to understand that whatever came next between us wasn't finished, only that it wasn't going to happen here, in front of strangers, with her husband's accusations still hanging unanswered in the air between every camera lens pointed her way. Leilani came to Josue's house that evening, driving her own car for the first time in longer than I wanted to think about. No driver, no Brayden. Trailing behind her with a tablet full of listing photos, just her alone, headlights swinging across the front windows as she pulled into the gravel drive around dusk. I watched her from the porch before she saw me. She sat in the car a long moment after cutting the engine, both hands still on the wheel. The particular stillness of a woman gathering whatever nerve it takes to walk toward a conversation she can't undo once it starts. When she finally got out, she was carrying something against her chest with both arms, a cardboard shoebox corners soft with age. The same box I'd watched her rest her hand against through oak branches 2 weeks before, the day Brayden called her family's sweetgrass baskets country and told her they didn't belong in the listing photos. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I didn't move to meet her halfway. Some part of me knew standing there that whatever ground got covered between us needed to be ground she walked herself. "Grandpa." Her voice broke on the single word, and then her knees simply gave out beneath her, right there on the gravel, and she went down onto them without seeming to decide to the shoebox still clutched against her chest, like the only solid thing left in a world that had stopped holding its shape. I came down the steps then, not fast, just steady the way I'd have crossed any ground that needed crossing, and stood in front of her while she knelt there in the dark with the porch light throwing long shadows across the drive. Somewhere behind me through the screen door, I heard Josue's footsteps go quiet in the kitchen, the particular stillness of a man deciding to give two people the privacy they needed without ever having to be asked for it. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words came out in pieces, breaking apart before she could finish them cleanly. "I'm so sorry. I told myself so many things, that it was just paperwork, that you'd understand once you saw the bigger picture, that Brayden knew what he was doing, even when some part of me kept asking questions I never let myself finish asking." I stood there and let her keep going, the way Josue had taught me. A man sometimes needs to let another person's whole storm pass through before he says a single word back. "I knew something was wrong," she said, looking down now at the shoebox instead of at me, unable to hold my eyes while she said the rest of it. "Not the land, not the courthouse file. I swear to you, I never knew any of that, not until today. Not until I watched you walk across that grass like something out of a dream. I didn't know I was still allowed to have. But I knew something was wrong with him, with us. I'd known for months. I just kept choosing not to look at it directly. Because looking at it directly meant admitting I'd built my whole life on somebody who was never going to hold it up the way I needed him to." Her hands tightened around the shoebox. "I was scared, Grandpa. Not just of losing him. Scared of what it would mean about me if I let myself see the truth and stayed anyway. Scared of what it would mean if I saw it and left. Either way, I was going to have to admit I'd spent 2 years making myself small enough to fit inside a marriage that was never going to make room for the rest of me." She opened the lid of the shoebox, then just slightly, just enough that I could see the edge of old photographs inside, corners curling, colors gone soft with time. She didn't take anything out. She just held it open a moment, like showing me the box itself was easier than finding words for what was actually inside it. "I found this in the hallway before I left the house for good," she said. "I don't even know why I grabbed it instead of anything else. Everything else in that house, I let him decide what mattered. This, I couldn't leave behind." I looked down at her, kneeling there on the gravel, at the box held open in her hands, at a face I'd watched grow from 9 years old to this, a face that had learned somewhere in the past 2 years how to make itself smaller than it was ever built to be. A cricket started up somewhere in the grass beside the drive, indifferent to either of us, and I found myself grateful for it, for one small, ordinary sound in a night that otherwise felt like it was holding its breath along with the rest of us. I didn't say anything yet. Some things a man has to let finish arriving before he decides how to answer them, and I could feel, standing there in the porch light with my granddaughter kneeling on the gravel in front of me, that whatever I said next was going to matter more than almost anything I'd said in longer than I could easily remember. So I stood there instead quiet, and let the night settle around both of us patient. the way I'd learned to be patient over these past 2 weeks, and waited to see what else she still needed to say before I owed her a single word back. Leilani reached into the shoebox and lifted out a folded piece of paper from beneath the top layer of photographs, yellowed at the creases, the kind of paper that had clearly been folded and unfolded many times over many years before it finally settled into staying closed. She held it out to me without quite looking at what she was handing over. "I found this at the bottom under the pictures," she said. "It's got your handwriting on it, Grandpa. I didn't read all of it. I didn't feel like it was mine to read, but I saw enough of the first line to know I needed to bring it to you instead of just putting it back." I took the letter from her, unfolded it carefully under the porch light, and felt something settle low in my chest the moment I recognized my own younger handwriting, looser and more hurried than it had become in later years, dated in the corner a full year before Emmeline and I ever married. I hadn't known this letter still existed. I'd written it during the worst stretch of that year, sealed it in an envelope I never mailed. And somewhere along the way, it must have gone into Emmeline's keeping instead of the trash, tucked into a box of photographs where it sat quiet for over 4 decades. "Dear Emmeline," it began, "I don't know how to tell you this without sounding like less of a man than I want you to think I am, so I'm going to write it down instead, because paper doesn't flinch the way my voice does." I read the rest of it standing there on the porch, Leilani watching my face instead of the letter, and for a moment I was 26 years old again, newly handed a piece of land and a secret I didn't yet understand the weight of, terrified that unless I built it into something bigger, something my father would have been proud enough of to finally say so out loud, I'd spend the rest of my life feeling like a disappointment, standing in a good man's shadow. I'd written in that letter about nearly selling off the northern 6 acres to a lumber outfit that year, just to prove to myself I could make something happen with the land, instead of simply holding on to what my father had left me. I'd written about the particular fear of being loved only for what I could provide, and the deeper fear underneath that one that if I stopped providing, whatever love was left over might not be enough to hold on its own. "I never sent it," I said quietly, mostly to myself. "Your grandmother found it in my truck a few weeks later, read it without my permission, and sat me down at her mother's kitchen table and told me the land didn't need me to prove anything to it, and neither did she. Took me the better part of a year to actually believe her." Leilani's eyes had filled, though she wasn't crying yet, just standing there with the weight of it settling into her, the same way it had settled into me 40-some years earlier. "You were scared of the exact same thing I've been scared of," she said. "That you weren't enough on your own. That you had to earn being wanted." "I was," I said. "Took me most of my life to understand that fear was lying to me the whole time. I'm sorry it took you finding an old letter in a shoebox for me to think to tell you that directly, instead of just hoping you'd figure it out the way I eventually did." We stood there a moment, in the quiet. The compass heavy in my pocket, the letter heavier still in my hand. And I understood, holding both of them, that whatever came next between us needed more than an apology on a gravel driveway to actually take root. "I'm not going to hand you money, Leilani," I said, and I watched her brace for the rest of it. "Not the land, not the account, not so much as a grocery bill covered quietly behind your back. If I do that now, I teach you the exact same lesson Brayden already taught you. That you only get to keep what somebody else is willing to hand you. I want better than that for you. I want you to learn what your grandmother spent a year teaching me." "What do I do?" Her voice was small, steadier than it had been, but small. "You build something with your own 2 hands for a year," I said. "Real work, work that doesn't run through anybody's checking account but your own. And you come back to this porch when that year's finished, not because I've forgiven you before you've earned it, but because you'll have finally proven something to yourself that no amount of money from me could ever prove for you." I reached out and touched her shoulder, the first time I'd touched her since before any of this began. "I'm not cutting you off, Leilani. I'm forcing you to stand on your own 2 feet, same as somebody once forced me." She nodded slow and gathered the shoebox back against her chest, letter and all. And after a long moment, she stood, brushed the gravel dust from her knees, and walked back toward her car without either of us saying anything else. I watched her taillights swing out of the driveway and disappear down the dark road toward wherever she meant to spend the night. And I stood there a long while after the sound of her engine had faded completely, not moving, the compass in my hand, though I couldn't have said when I'd taken it out of my pocket. My thumb tracing the worn engraving over and over in the dark until my hand finally, quietly, stopped shaking. The tide was coming in slow across the mudflats behind Penn Center the morning we finally made it official, that particular unhurried rhythm the marsh keeps, no matter what's happening on the ground beside it, patient the way it had been patient through everything that came before this. A year had passed since a groundbreaking ceremony that never broke ground on anything but the truth, and I stood on a small wooden stage a fraction of the size of the one Brayden Stein had rented, in front of a crowd considerably smaller than 40 investors, but somehow heavier with meaning than that whole gathering had ever managed to be. Brayden was serving out the first of what would eventually be 11 years convicted on counts of elder financial exploitation, forgery, and fraud that took a jury less than 4 hours to work through once the evidence was laid out plain in front of them. Ronan Schneider had gotten his money back through the courts, every dollar of it, and moved on to whatever came next for a man like that, without ever once looking back towards St. Helena Island again. I didn't think about either of them much these days. Some debts once collected simply stopped mattering to the person who was owed them. The crowd gathered that morning for Heritage Days was mostly familiar faces, Joseph near the front with his arms crossed and something close to pride sitting easy on his face, Trent standing at parade rest out of old habit, even in retirement, Kari and Adonis together near the refreshment table, Carter with his grandmother on his arm, walking slower these days, but walking still. Eva Choi had driven down from her office for the occasion, taking a rare Saturday away from a caseload that never seemed to shrink, no matter how many families she helped. A handful of strangers stood scattered through the rest of the crowd, 2 families I'd never met before that week, each of them holding their own quiet version of the same story. A piece of land, a shaky claim, a fear of losing what their people had bled to hold on to. I stood at the small podium and unfolded a single page of notes I barely needed because I'd said this particular thing to myself so many times over the past year that the words had worn smooth as creek stones. A year ago, I said, a man stood not far from this spot and told a crowd that a piece of land belonged to him. He was wrong about that, and the truth of how wrong he was cost him considerably more than the land itself ever could have. I looked out at the gathered faces at the marsh beyond them, catching the morning light the way it always had, indifferent and patient and entirely unbothered by which family currently held the deed to whichever corner of it. What I learned watching that morning unfold is that land held quietly by one man, kept secret even from the people who love him, protects nothing in the long run except loneliness. So today, this land stops being quiet. I explained the rest the way Josue and I had rehearsed it, the Bradford Land Trust, funded by the very acreage Brayden had tried to steal, structured to provide interest-free loans and legal defense funding to any heir's property family across the Low Country, facing the exact kind of quiet theft my own father had fought off alone in 1961, back before anybody thought to build an institution that might fight that battle so no single family ever had to carry it by themselves again. The applause that followed was smaller than 40 investors' worth, but it didn't need to be bigger. It filled the space it needed to fill. I was still shaking a few hands near the edge of the stage when I saw her. Leilani stood near the back of the crowd, dressed simply, her hair pulled back the way she used to wear it as a girl, before she'd learned to soften every edge of herself for somebody else's comfort. She held a folder against her chest, not a shoebox this time, and even from that distance I could see the calluses on her hands had changed since I'd last stood close enough to notice such things. The particular toughness that comes from a year of work that runs through nobody's checking account but your own. She didn't rush toward me. She waited the same patient waiting I'd watched her practice on my own porch steps a year before, until the last well-wisher had finished shaking my hand, and the crowd had thinned enough that the space between us stood open and unclaimed by anybody else. I stepped down from the small stage. The tide kept coming in behind us, same as it always had, same as it would keep doing long after both of us were gone from this ground entirely. Leilani crossed the last of the distance between us and stopped an arm's length away, close enough now that I could see her hands trembling slightly around the folder she carried, though her eyes held mine steady in a way they hadn't managed to do a year earlier. "I told you I'd come back," she said, "when the year was finished." "You did," I said, "and here you are." We stood there a moment, the two of us, with a whole year of separate distance folded up quiet between us. The tide still coming in behind me, the marsh grass bending soft in the same wind it always bent in, waiting to see which one of us would be the first to close what was left of it. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the compass, the same brass case I'd carried through every stretch of this past year, worn smoother now than it had been even a year before from all the turning I'd done with it in my hands while I waited to see how this particular story was going to end. "Open your folder first," I said. "Let me see what a year bought you." Leilani opened it there in the morning light, and I looked through pages of pay stubs from a construction crew out of Buford, a completion certificate from an apprenticeship program in historic restoration, and beneath all of it a set of photographs, her in work boots and a hard hat, standing beside a half-restored praise house not 2 miles from where we stood. The kind of building this whole island had once been full of, and was slowly, carefully learning how to save instead of lose. Her hands in those photographs looked nothing like the hands that had once rested soft on a cedar chest lid, and everything like hands that had earned every callus honestly. "I didn't want to just do any work," she said, watching my face as I turned through the photographs. "I wanted to do work that meant something close to what almost got taken from us. Learning how buildings like this get put back together instead of torn down for something newer. It felt like the only kind of penance that actually made sense to me." I closed the folder gently and handed it back to her. Then I held out the compass. She looked at it a long moment before she took it, the way a person looks at something they understand even before being told carries more weight than its size would suggest. "This was my father's," I said. "Before that, it was passed down further than either of us has any record of because record-keeping wasn't always something this family was allowed to do openly. There's a line engraved inside the case, worn thin now, but you can still feel it if you run your thumb along it right." I watched her open the case and find the words with her fingertip the same way I'd done 1,000 times over the past year. "Boundaries protect, they don't divide." My father lived by those words his whole life, and never told a soul why not, even me, until I found the same reason waiting in a sealed courthouse file 60 years later. "Why didn't he tell you?" she asked. "Same reason I didn't tell you sooner than I did," I said, and I felt the truth of it settle, even as I spoke it aloud for the first time. He believed silence was a kind of protection, keep the truth close enough nobody could ever use it as a weapon against the people he loved. What he never accounted for is that silence protects the land, maybe. It doesn't protect the people standing on it. Not really. Sometimes it just leaves them standing there alone, same as it left him, same as it very nearly left me with you. Leilani closed her hand around the compass, closed the case, held it against her chest, the same protective way she'd once held that shoebox on my gravel driveway. "I'm giving this to you," I said, "not because you've earned the land back. You haven't, and I'm not sure that's a debt any single year of hard work could fully settle. I'm giving it to you because you've earned something better than the land. You've earned the truth of what it actually means, instead of the silence I almost let you inherit in its place." She looked up at me, and for the first time in longer than either of us could probably count, I watched something in her face settle into place the way a compass needle settles once it's finally found true north and stopped searching. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." I nodded and reached out to pull her into an embrace I'd been waiting the better part of a year to be ready to give, the tide still coming in slow behind us. The whole gathered crowd of Heritage Days moving on around us to look at basket weavers and oyster roasts and children chasing each other across the grass, indifferent to the two of us standing there, working our way back towards something that resembled family again. She felt smaller in my arms than I remembered, and sturdier at the same time. The particular contradiction of a person who has spent a year learning exactly how much weight her own 2 hands can actually carry. What I never told her standing on that ground was the truth of how many mornings I'd sat parked in Carter's borrowed truck across from my own front porch, watching her through the gap in the oak branches, testing how far she'd let herself go before some old instinct in her finally pulled her back. I never told her how closely I'd studied her hesitation over that cedar chest, weighing it, measuring it, deciding whether it was enough evidence of the woman I remembered raising to risk everything I still had left on the gamble that she'd find her own way home. Some things I'd learned from my father a person carries alone, not because the truth would break anybody, but simply because certain weights were never meant to be handed off, only carried a while longer before they finally quietly grow light enough to set down on their own. Later that afternoon, after the crowd at Heritage Days had thinned toward the food tents and the basket weavers, I watched Leilani slip the compass into the inside pocket of her own jacket, the same pocket I'd carried it in for a year, and walk on ahead of me toward the water without once looking back to see if I was following. She didn't need to look back. Some part of her already knew I was. We spend so much of our lives believing that silence is the same thing as protection, that if we simply hold the hardest truths close enough, tight enough, long enough, we can keep the people we love from ever being hurt by them. But truth doesn't work the way land does. Land can sit quiet under lock and deed for 60 years and still be exactly what it always was when somebody finally opens the file. People are not land. The people we love need to be let in, not shielded, or the silence meant to protect them slowly becomes the very thing standing between us and them. I think about all the years my father carried his secret alone, and all the months I nearly did the same. Neither of us was wrong to love as fiercely as we did. We were only wrong about what love required of us. God doesn't ask a man to carry his family's truth by himself forever. God asks him eventually to set it down, where the people he loves can finally see it too. I believe God places people like Leilani in our lives exactly to teach us that lesson, slow as we are to learn it. If you were standing where I stood, holding a truth that could either protect your family or finally set them free, would you have carried it alone as long as I did? Or handed it over sooner and trusted the people you love to hold it with you? I'd love to hear which one you would have chosen and why, down in the comments below. If this story found something true in your own life, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next one worth carrying home.